The phone rang just as Robert Hayes was taking a cup of coffee to the back porch. It was early Saturday morning, and sunlight was slowly spreading across the quiet neighborhood. Robert had been looking forward to that weekend for weeks. His son Ethan had told him that the family was going to spend 2 days at the mountain retreat Robert had built years ago. It was supposed to be a family weekend, a chance to sit around the fireplace, a chance to watch the sunset over the mountains, and most importantly, a chance for Robert to spend time with the son he had raised almost entirely on his own. He picked up the phone with a smile. "Hey, Ethan, everything ready for today?" There was a brief silence on the other end. Then Ethan spoke. "Dad, actually I was going to call you about that." Robert stopped walking. "About what?" Another pause. Then his son said something Robert never expected to hear. "Dad, you don't need to come this weekend." Robert stared through the glass doors toward his empty backyard. "What do you mean?" Ethan lowered his voice. "Lauren thinks it would be better if we just had some private family time this weekend." Robert's fingers tightened around the coffee cup. "Private family time? Yeah, you know how it is. She just wants things to be more relaxed." Robert forced a small laugh. "But Ethan, I'm family." "I know, Dad." The answer came too quickly, almost like Ethan had already practiced it. Robert swallowed. "So you're saying I'm not invited?" "No, that's not what I'm saying." "But that's exactly what you're saying." Silence. For several seconds, neither father nor son spoke. Then Ethan finally said, "Don't make this a big deal, Dad. We'll see you another time." The call ended. Robert slowly lowered the phone. He remained standing there, staring at the dark screen. For years, that mountain retreat had been the one place where he believed his family would always have a place. He had built it with his own hands. He had paid for every room, every piece of wood, every window overlooking the mountains. And Ethan had grown up hearing his father say the same thing. "One day, this place will belong to our family." Robert had always meant that as a promise, but suddenly he wondered if his son had understood it as something else entirely. He placed the phone on the kitchen counter. Then he looked at the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. Saturday, the day they were supposed to leave. Robert had already packed his suitcase. His favorite jacket was hanging beside the front door. A box of his son's favorite cookies sat on the counter, ready to take with him. He looked at the box for a long moment. Then he quietly put it back inside the cabinet. Robert didn't call Ethan again. He didn't call Lauren either. He simply walked to the window and stared outside. For the first time, a painful thought entered his mind. Maybe his son wasn't asking him to stay home because he wanted privacy. Maybe someone had been slowly convincing Ethan that Robert no longer belonged in the life he had spent decades building for him. And Robert had no idea that this phone call was only the beginning. 3 days after that phone call, Robert still hadn't mentioned it to anyone. He went through his mornings normally. Coffee at 7, a short walk around the neighborhood, the newspaper at the kitchen table. But something had changed. Every time he thought about the mountain retreat, he remembered Ethan's voice. "Dad, you don't need to come." Robert had heard those words so many times in his head that they had almost stopped sounding real. The truth was, that retreat had never been just a vacation property. It had started with a promise. 20 years earlier, Robert and his wife, Margaret, had been driving through the mountains during a short weekend trip. They stopped at a small overlook just before sunset. The valley below was covered in golden light, and the distant mountains looked almost unreal. Margaret had stepped out of the car and stood quietly beside him. "One day," she said, "I'd love to wake up somewhere like this." Robert smiled. "You mean when we're old?" She laughed. "No, I mean when we're finally done raising everyone else." At the time, they had no money for dreams like that. Robert worked as a construction supervisor. Margaret was a school librarian. Their lives revolved around mortgage payments, school expenses, groceries, and their son Ethan. But they never forgot that conversation. Years passed. Ethan grew older. He went to college, started working, and eventually married Lauren. Robert and Margaret were proud of him. They had always believed that raising a child meant giving him the freedom to build a life of his own. Then, just when Robert and Margaret finally had time to think about themselves, everything changed. Margaret became seriously ill. The mountain trips stopped. The weekend drives disappeared. Their plans were replaced by hospital rooms, medication schedules, and long nights beside a hospital bed. Margaret fought for nearly 2 years. Robert stayed beside her through every appointment and every difficult night. One evening, when she was too weak to sit up, she reached for his hand. "Did you ever build that place?" she asked. Robert knew exactly what she meant. He smiled sadly. "Not yet." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Then don't let the dream die with me." Those were some of the last words she ever said to him. Margaret passed away 6 months later. Robert was devastated. For months, he barely touched the plans they had once made together. Then one Sunday afternoon, while cleaning an old drawer, he found a folded piece of paper. It was a rough sketch Margaret had drawn years earlier. A simple mountain house, a wide wooden porch, large windows, a stone fireplace. Nothing luxurious, just a quiet place where their family could gather. Robert stared at the drawing for a long time. Then he whispered, "Okay, Margaret." The following spring, he bought a small piece of land in the mountains. It took nearly 3 years to finish the retreat. Robert chose every detail himself: the wooden floors, the stone fireplace, the porch facing the valley, the long dining table where the entire family could sit together. When construction was finally complete, Robert stood alone in the living room. For a moment, he could almost imagine Margaret standing beside him. He placed her old sketch on the fireplace mantel. Then he smiled. "We finally made it." From that day forward, the mountain retreat became the heart of the family. Ethan brought Lauren there after their wedding. Later, they celebrated birthdays there, Christmas dinners, family reunions, long summer evenings around the fire. Robert never cared who slept in which room or who used the kitchen. It was never about ownership to him. It was about family. He had built the place believing that one day Ethan would bring his own children there, that the house would remain a place where everyone felt welcome. But Robert had made one mistake. He had confused giving his family a home with giving them control over it. And he was about to discover just how expensive that mistake could become. For the first year after the mountain retreat was completed, everything felt exactly the way Robert had imagined. Ethan and Lauren visited often. They brought groceries, they helped prepare dinner. They laughed around the fireplace. Robert never questioned anything. If Lauren wanted to rearrange a few things, he didn't mind. If Ethan wanted to invite friends, Robert welcomed them. After all, this was what he had built the place for: family. But slowly, almost too quietly to notice, things began to change. It started with the guest room. One weekend, Robert arrived at the retreat and noticed that the furniture had been moved. The small wooden desk he had placed beside the window was gone. In its place stood a large modern desk with 2 computer monitors. Robert looked at Lauren. "What's all this?" She smiled. "Oh, I hope you don't mind. I thought that this room would make a perfect office for me." Robert looked around. "You're working from here now?" "Sometimes." She laughed lightly. "It doesn't hurt to make the room useful, right?" Robert forced a smile. "Of course not." He didn't think much about it. A few weeks later, Lauren replaced the curtains in the living room. Then came new lamps, then new dining chairs, then a large television mounted above the fireplace. Every change came with the same explanation. "It'll make the house better." Robert usually nodded. He didn't want to be the difficult father-in-law complaining about decorations. But eventually, the changes became more than decoration. One Saturday morning, Robert walked into the kitchen and found Lauren going through one of the cabinets. "What are you looking for?" "Just reorganizing." She pulled several of Robert's favorite dishes from a cabinet and placed them in a box. Robert frowned. "Those belong to Margaret." Lauren paused. "Oh." She looked at the dishes. "I didn't know they were important." Robert gently took the box from her. "They are." Lauren gave him a polite smile. "Of course." But there was something in her expression that Robert couldn't quite explain. Later that afternoon, Ethan pulled his father aside. "Dad, don't take Lauren's changes personally." "I don't. She just likes things organized." Robert nodded. "I understand." And he did. Or at least, he wanted to. Then the next summer, Lauren began making decisions about the property without asking him. She arranged landscaping work. She ordered new outdoor furniture. She even hired someone to install a security system. Robert only discovered it when he received the bill. He called Ethan. "Did you know about this?" "Yeah, Dad." "You could have told me." Lauren handled it. Robert was quiet. "It's my property, Ethan." "I know." The answer came quickly. "But she's just trying to improve the place." Robert looked out the window. The mountain retreat was beautiful, exactly as he and Margaret had imagined. Yet somehow, every time he returned, it felt a little less like his. The most troubling moment came several months later. Robert arrived early one Friday morning. He walked through the front door and heard Lauren speaking on the phone upstairs. He wasn't trying to listen, but one sentence stopped him. "We'll eventually make this our main family place." Robert froze. He stood silently in the hallway. A few seconds later, Lauren came downstairs. She stopped when she saw him. "Oh, you're here." Robert smiled. "Apparently." She laughed awkwardly. "I was just talking about the future." "What future?" Lauren hesitated. Then she shrugged. "Nothing serious." Robert didn't push her. But that night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about one phrase. Our main family place. Not Robert's retreat. Not Dad's house. Not Margaret's dream. Their place. He told himself he was overthinking it. He told himself that Lauren was simply excited about the future. He told himself that Ethan would never allow anyone to disrespect him. But deep down, Robert knew something had changed. And the next time he visited the mountain retreat, he noticed something even more unsettling. His key no longer opened the small storage room beside the garage. He tried it twice, then a third time. The lock had been replaced. Robert stood there holding his key, staring at the new lock. He hadn't been told, he hadn't been asked, and for the first time, A thought entered his mind that he didn't want to believe. Someone was beginning to treat his home as if it belonged to them, and Robert had no idea how far they were willing to go. The lock on the storage room bothered Robert more than he wanted to admit. He could have asked Lauren about it. He could have called Ethan. But instead, he decided to let it go, at least for the moment. Robert had spent too many years learning that not every uncomfortable feeling needed to become an argument. So the following weekend, he arrived at the retreat as usual. This time, however, Lauren was waiting for him on the front porch. "Dad, can we talk?" Robert nodded. "Sure." She gestured toward the chair beside her. They sat facing the mountains. For several seconds, Lauren said nothing. Then she took a slow breath. "You know, Ethan and I really love this place." Robert smiled faintly. "I know. We've been thinking about the future." Robert looked at her. "What kind of future?" Lauren folded her hands in her lap. "Well, you're not getting any younger." Robert almost laughed. "I've noticed." She smiled, but her expression quickly became serious again. "You travel less now. You don't come here as often as you used to." Robert looked toward the valley. "I come when I want to." "I know." She paused. "But you don't really need this place anymore." The sentence landed harder than Robert expected. He turned toward her. "Excuse me." Lauren quickly raised her hands. "I didn't mean it that way." "Then what way did you mean it?" "I just mean that Ethan and I use it much more than you do." Robert stared at her. "So?" "Well," she hesitated, "maybe it would make sense for us to take more responsibility for it." Robert remained silent. Lauren continued. "We could handle the maintenance, the bills, the landscaping, everything." "I already handle those things. I know." She smiled. "But you don't have to anymore." Robert slowly shook his head. "Lauren, I built this place. I know. For your husband. I know. And for our family." Lauren looked away. "Exactly." Robert frowned. "What does that mean?" She didn't answer immediately. Then she said quietly, "It means you should let the next generation start taking care of it." Robert felt something tighten inside his chest. The next generation. Ethan and me. There it was. No hesitation, no embarrassment. She wasn't talking about someday. She was talking about now. Robert stood from the chair. "I think you're getting ahead of yourself." Lauren's expression changed. "I didn't mean to offend you." "You didn't offend me." Robert looked directly at her. "You surprised me." That evening, Ethan came home from a business trip. Robert waited until dinner before bringing up the conversation. "Ethan, your wife thinks I don't need the retreat anymore." Ethan stopped eating. "Dad, she thinks you should take over the responsibility." Ethan sighed. "She's not wrong." Robert slowly put his fork down. "What?" "You don't use the place that much anymore." "That doesn't mean I don't need it." "Dad, you're almost 70. Robert stared at his son. "I know how old I am." "I'm not trying to insult you." "Then what are you trying to do?" Ethan looked uncomfortable. "We're trying to plan for the future." Robert leaned back. "Whose future?" "Our family's." Robert gave a quiet, bitter laugh. "I thought I was part of that family." "You are." "Then why does every conversation make me feel like I'm standing outside the door?" Ethan had no answer. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the old wall clock. Finally, Ethan said, "Dad, nobody is trying to take anything from you." Robert looked at him. "Then why do I keep hearing about things being changed without anyone asking me?" Ethan looked away. Robert knew that silence was an answer. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood and walked outside. The mountain air was cold that evening. Robert sat alone on the porch where he and Margaret had once imagined growing old together. He looked through the windows. The house was full of expensive furniture now. New decorations, new technology, new rules. Everything looked beautiful. Yet Robert suddenly realized something painful. The house hadn't changed ownership, but the way his family treated him had. And perhaps that was even more dangerous. Because when people begin acting as though something belongs to them, sometimes the legal papers are the last thing they remember to change. The next morning, Robert woke up before sunrise. He had barely slept. The conversation from the previous evening kept returning to his mind. You don't really need this place anymore. He tried to convince himself that Lauren had simply chosen the wrong words. Maybe Ethan was only thinking about helping. Maybe Robert was reading too much into everything. But something inside him refused to settle. After breakfast, he decided to drive to the mountain retreat. He didn't tell Ethan. He didn't tell Lauren. For the first time in years, Robert wanted to see his own property without anyone there to explain what he was supposed to think. The 2-hour drive passed quietly. When he finally reached the retreat, the house looked peaceful from the outside. The porch lights were off. The driveway was empty. Robert unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Everything seemed normal. Almost too normal. He walked through the living room, then the kitchen, then the hallway. As he passed the office upstairs, he noticed the door was slightly open. Robert stopped. That room had originally been a small reading room for Margaret. Now Lauren used it as her office. He had never entered without asking, but this time something caught his attention. A printer was running. Robert walked closer. A sheet of paper slowly came out. He picked it up. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. Then he saw the heading. Property Transition Plan. Robert's heart skipped. He read the first page. The document wasn't an official deed. It wasn't a completed transfer, but it was a proposal prepared for a future ownership arrangement. The names Ethan and Lauren appeared repeatedly. Robert read further. There were notes about renovations, future maintenance responsibilities, long-term possession, and eventually a transfer of the property. Robert's hands began to shake. He turned to the next page. A handwritten note had been added at the bottom. Robert may be more comfortable transferring responsibility gradually. Robert stared at those words. More comfortable. He sat down slowly. For several minutes, he couldn't move. Then he heard footsteps downstairs. Robert quickly placed the papers back on the desk. Lauren appeared in the doorway. She froze when she saw him. Robert? He looked at her. What is this? Lauren's face changed. What? He held up the document. This. She walked toward him, then stopped. It isn't what you think. Robert gave a quiet laugh. That's what everyone says when it is exactly what I think. Lauren looked nervous. It's just planning. Planning for what? She didn't answer. Planning for my retirement? No. My death? Robert, My property? Lauren finally looked down. It was Ethan's idea. Robert stared at her. Don't put this on Ethan. She looked surprised. He said you would eventually want us to take over. Robert's voice became quieter. Eventually? Lauren nodded. You're getting older. We thought it would make things easier. Robert looked around the room. The photographs, the furniture, the mountain view, everything he had built with Margaret. everything he had intended to leave as a gift to his family one day. Then he looked back at Lauren. "You thought it would make things easier for whom?" She had no answer. Robert folded the document carefully. "You know what hurts the most?" Lauren remained silent. "I could have given this to you." Her eyes widened. "What?" "I could have given it to Ethan one day." Robert's voice trembled. "I built this place for my family. I never wanted to keep it from him." Lauren looked at him. "Then why are you upset?" Robert stared at her. "Because you stopped waiting for me to give it." The room became completely silent. Lauren's eyes filled with tears. "That's not fair." Robert shook his head. "No. What's not fair is finding out that my own family has already planned what happens to something I worked my entire life to build." He placed the papers on the desk. Then he walked toward the door. Lauren followed him. "Robert, please." He stopped. She spoke softly. "We didn't mean to hurt you." Robert turned around. "I believe you." Lauren looked relieved. Then he added, "And that's exactly what scares me." He walked downstairs. At the front door, he paused. For years, Robert had believed the greatest danger to a family was losing money. That morning, he finally understood. Sometimes the real danger was when love made you ignore the warning signs. He stepped outside and closed the door behind him. But before getting into his car, Robert made a decision. He would no longer wait for his family to decide what happened to his life. This time, he would decide first. Robert drove home without turning on the radio. The road stretched ahead of him, but his mind was somewhere else. He kept thinking about the document, property transition plan. Those 3 words had changed the way he looked at everything. The new furniture, the changed locks, the conversations about the future. Lauren telling him he didn't need the retreat anymore. None of it had been random. They had been preparing for something. By the time Robert reached home, he had already made one decision. He needed to hear the truth from Ethan, not from Lauren, not from a lawyer, from his son. That evening, Robert called him. "Ethan, can you come over tomorrow?" There was a brief pause. "Is something wrong?" "I just want to talk." Another pause. "Okay, Dad." The next afternoon, Ethan arrived alone. Robert had already made coffee. They sat across from each other at the dining table. For a few minutes, neither man spoke. Finally, Robert placed the document on the table. Ethan looked at it. His face immediately changed. "Where did you get that?" Robert stared at him. "So you knew about it." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Dad, listen. I asked you a question." "Yes." The answer was quiet. Robert nodded. "At least you're finally being honest." Ethan rubbed his forehead. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "Then how was it supposed to happen?" "We were going to talk to you." "When?" Ethan didn't answer. Robert leaned forward. "Next month?" Silence. "Next year?" Still nothing. "Or after you had already convinced yourself the house belonged to you?" Ethan looked hurt. "That isn't fair." Robert laughed softly. "Fair?" He shook his head. "Do you know what isn't fair, Ethan?" He pointed toward the document. "Your mother and I spent years dreaming about that place." Ethan looked down. "I know." "No, you don't." Robert's voice became heavier. "You know the house. You don't know what it cost me to build it." Ethan remained silent. Robert continued. "Your mother died before she could ever see it finished." Ethan's eyes lifted. "I remember. I built it because she asked me not to let the dream die." Robert paused. "And then I gave that dream to my family." Ethan swallowed. "I never asked you to give it to me." Robert looked at him. "That's exactly the point." Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" It means I was going to. The room fell silent. Robert's eyes filled with emotion, but his voice remained calm. One day, Ethan, I probably would have left that place to you. Ethan stared at his father. Then why are you acting like we're trying to steal it? Robert's expression changed. Because you stopped waiting for me to give it. Ethan looked away. Robert continued. You changed things without asking me. I didn't do that. Lauren did. And you think I should fight with my wife over everything? Robert stared at him. No. He paused. I think you should have remembered who your father was before you decided who should own his property. Ethan became defensive. Dad, we're trying to build a family too. I know. And we need somewhere stable. You have a home. This place is different because it's mine. Ethan's jaw tightened. That's not what I mean. Then tell me what you mean. Ethan remained quiet. Robert waited. Finally, Ethan spoke. Dad, you're almost 70. Robert's eyes narrowed. I know. You don't need a huge mountain property anymore. Robert slowly stood. So that's what this is about. I'm just being realistic. No. Robert shook his head. You're being impatient. Ethan stood as well. I'm your son. And I am your father. Neither man moved. Then Ethan said the sentence that Robert would remember for the rest of his life. Dad, eventually this will all be ours anyway. The words hung in the air. Robert stared at him. Not angry, not shouting, just deeply disappointed. Eventually, Ethan immediately realized what he had said. Dad, I didn't mean... Yes, you did. Robert looked toward the window. Outside, the evening sun was disappearing behind the trees. For years, Robert had believed his son saw the mountain retreat as a gift. Now, he understood. Ethan had started seeing it as an inheritance, and there was a painful difference between those two things. Robert turned back toward him. You know what hurts, Ethan? His son said nothing. It isn't that you want the house. Robert's voice trembled. It's that you've already started planning my life around the assumption that I won't be here to object. Ethan's face fell. Dad! Robert raised his hand. Don't. He walked toward the front door. Ethan followed. Please, Dad, let's talk about this. Robert opened the door. We just did. But we're family. Robert looked at him for a long moment. Yes. Then he quietly added, and family should never make you feel like you have to defend your right to belong in your own home. Ethan stood frozen on the porch. Robert closed the door. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a father protecting his son. He felt like a man protecting himself. And that night, Robert made a decision Ethan would never see coming. 2 weeks passed. Robert didn't call Ethan. Ethan didn't call Robert. The silence between them became longer with every passing day. Then, on a Friday afternoon, Ethan and Lauren drove toward the mountain retreat. They had planned the weekend for months. Lauren had already arranged for a contractor to come on Saturday morning. There were renovations she wanted to discuss. New flooring, a larger kitchen island, and eventually changes to the upstairs rooms. To Lauren, it was no longer simply a vacation. It was the beginning of something permanent. As their car climbed the familiar mountain road, Lauren smiled. It's going to look amazing after we finish everything. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. Yeah. You're still worried about your dad? Ethan was quiet. I think he'll come around. Lauren reached over and squeezed his arm. He'll understand eventually. Neither of them knew that Robert had already made sure there would be no eventually for the plans they had made. When they reached the property, Lauren immediately noticed something strange. The front gate was locked. She frowned. That's new. Ethan stepped out of the car. He walked toward the gate and noticed a small sign attached to it. He read it once, then again. His face changed. Lauren walked over. What does it say? Ethan didn't answer. She took the paper from his hand. Her eyes moved across the words. Private property. Access by authorization only. Lauren looked at him. What is this? I don't know. Ethan pulled out his phone and called his father. No answer. He called again. Still nothing. Lauren looked toward the house. Maybe your dad is inside. They walked toward the front door. Ethan took out his key. He inserted it into the lock. It didn't turn. He tried again. Nothing. Lauren stared at him. Did you change the locks? No. Then who did? Ethan stepped back. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan noticed another envelope attached to the door. His name was written across the front. Ethan Hayes. He opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a short letter. No anger, no accusations. Just a few carefully written lines. Ethan read silently. His face became pale. Lauren took the letter from him. She read it, then looked up. What does it mean? Ethan finally answered. He changed the legal access. Lauren frowned. That doesn't make sense. It does. Ethan looked toward the house. My dad's attorney handled it. Lauren's expression hardened. But why? Ethan didn't answer. A few minutes later, his phone rang. It was Martin, Robert's attorney. Ethan hesitated before answering. Hello? Mr. Hayes? Why can't we get inside the property? Martin's voice remained calm. Because Mr. Hayes has restricted access until further notice. Ethan's jaw tightened. This is my family home. No, sir. Martin paused. It's Robert Hayes's property. Ethan looked at Lauren. We've been using that place for years. I understand. Then why are you treating us like strangers? Because you're not the owner. The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. He looked at the house. The place where he had celebrated birthdays, Christmases, family dinners. The place he had slowly begun imagining as his own. Suddenly, none of that mattered legally. Martin continued. Your father has also instructed me that no renovations, alterations, or permanent changes are authorized without his written permission. Lauren's face turned red. But we've already spent money planning. Ethan quickly covered the phone. Lauren. She stopped. He returned to the call. Can we speak to my father? I'm afraid not today. Why? Because he asked me to handle this communication. Ethan swallowed. Did he sell the property? There was a pause. No. Ethan exhaled. Then what did he do? Martin's voice became even more careful. Your father has placed the property under a new legal arrangement that protects his ownership and determines exactly how the property may be used in the future. Ethan stared at the mountain view. And what does that mean for us? It means you no longer have any authority over the property. The call ended. For several seconds, Ethan stood completely still. Lauren looked at him. What are we going to do? Ethan didn't answer. He looked at the front door, at the windows, at the porch where he had once sat beside his father. For the first time, he understood what Robert had been trying to tell him. The retreat had never belonged to Ethan. He had simply become comfortable pretending that it did. Lauren broke the silence. This isn't over. Ethan slowly turned toward her. Yes, it is. She stared at him. What? Ethan looked down at the letter in his hand. I think we finally pushed him too far. Lauren said nothing. They returned to the car without entering the house. As they drove down the mountain, Ethan looked through the rear window one last time. The retreat disappeared behind the trees, and for the first time, Ethan wasn't thinking about losing a property. He was thinking about losing his father, because somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing Robert as the man who had given him everything. He had started seeing him as the man standing between him and an inheritance. And now, the consequences were finally real. 3 days after the mountain retreat incident, Ethan finally drove to his father's house. This time, he came alone. No Lauren, no excuses, no plans. He parked in the driveway and remained inside the car for nearly 5 minutes. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say, but every version sounded wrong. Finally, he stepped out and walked to the front door. He knocked. Robert opened it. For a moment, father and son simply stared at each other. Robert didn't look angry. That somehow made Ethan feel worse. "Can I come in?" Robert stepped aside. Ethan walked into the living room. Everything looked exactly the same. The old photographs, the wooden bookshelf, his mother's picture above the fireplace, the chair where Robert used to sit every evening. Ethan suddenly felt like a child again. He sat down. Robert remained standing. After a long silence, Ethan spoke. "I was wrong." Robert didn't respond. Ethan looked at his father. "I thought I was protecting my family. You were protecting your plans." Ethan lowered his eyes. "Yes." Robert finally sat across from him. "What changed?" Ethan took a deep breath. "When I stood outside that house and couldn't get inside," he paused, "I realized I had forgotten something." Robert waited. "That house was never mine." Robert nodded slowly. "No. I kept telling myself that one day you'd give it to me." Ethan swallowed. "But somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of it as something you'd give me." He looked at his father. "I started thinking I was entitled to it." Robert's expression softened slightly. That was the problem. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "I know." He looked toward the photograph of his mother. "Did Mom really want that place?" Robert nodded. "She did." "Then why didn't you ever tell me everything?" Robert smiled sadly. "Because I didn't think you needed to know." Ethan shook his head. "I should have." Robert remained quiet. Ethan continued. "Lauren kept saying we needed security for the future." Robert looked at him. "And you believed her?" "Yes." "Why?" Ethan hesitated. "Because I thought you were going to leave it to us anyway." Robert leaned back. "I probably would have." Ethan's head lifted. "What?" "I said I probably would have." Robert's voice remained calm. "Not because you demanded it." He paused. "Because you were my son." Ethan wiped his eyes. "Then why did you change everything?" Robert looked toward the window. "Because inheritance is a gift, Ethan." He turned back toward him. "It isn't something you take before the person giving it is even gone." Ethan nodded. "I understand now." Robert studied his son's face. "I hope you do." Ethan stood. "Dad," he stopped. "I don't expect you to give me the house." Robert said nothing. "I don't expect you to change anything." Still nothing. "I just want my father back." Those words finally broke through Robert's calm expression. His eyes became wet. He looked down for a moment. Then he said quietly, "You should have thought about that before you made me feel like I was already gone." Ethan began to cry. "I know." Robert stood. For several seconds, neither man moved. Then Ethan stepped forward. "Can I hug you?" Robert hesitated. "Just for a moment." Then he opened his arms. Ethan embraced his father tightly. Robert held him. Not because everything was fixed, not because the property issue had disappeared, but because Ethan was still his son. And despite everything that had happened, Robert didn't want anger to become the only thing left between them. After a few moments, Ethan pulled away. "I'll talk to Lauren." Robert nodded. "You need to make your own decisions now." Ethan looked confused. "What do you mean?" Robert answered carefully. "Being married doesn't mean you stop thinking for yourself." Ethan looked down. "I know." He walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned around. "Dad?" "Yes." "Will you ever let me come back to the mountain retreat?" Robert thought for a moment. "One day." Ethan smiled faintly. "When?" "When you stop seeing it as something you deserve." Ethan nodded. "And start seeing it as something you're grateful to be invited into." Ethan opened the door. "I understand." He stepped outside. Robert watched him walk toward the car. For the first time in weeks, the distance between father and son felt a little smaller. But Robert knew something important. Forgiveness could begin with one conversation. Trust could not. Trust had to be rebuilt, one choice at a time. 6 months passed. Life at Robert's house became quiet again. There were no more arguments about the mountain retreat, no unexpected plans, no conversations about ownership, no one telling Robert what he should do with something he had spent years building. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. The legal arrangement Martin had prepared remained in place. The mountain retreat was still Robert's, but Robert no longer looked at it as something he needed to protect every single day. He simply knew that it was his, and that was enough. Ethan also changed. He didn't ask about the property anymore. He didn't ask about the future. He didn't ask what Robert planned to leave him. Instead, he started visiting his father every Sunday. Sometimes they watched football. Sometimes they worked in the garden. Sometimes they simply sat together drinking coffee. At first, their conversations were awkward. There were years of trust that needed to be rebuilt. But slowly, things began to feel normal again. One Sunday afternoon, Ethan brought an old wooden box with him. Robert looked at it curiously. "What is that?" Ethan placed it on the table. "I found it in the garage." Robert opened the box. Inside was an old photograph. Margaret was standing beside the mountain overlook where the dream had first begun. Robert smiled. "I haven't seen this in years." Ethan sat across from him. "I thought you should have it." Robert looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he looked at his son. "Thank you." Ethan smiled. There was no mention of the house, no mention of inheritance. Just a father and son, sitting together. A few weeks later, Robert finally invited Ethan back to the mountain retreat. Not because Ethan had demanded it, not because he expected to inherit it, because Robert wanted him there. When they arrived, Robert unlocked the front door himself. Ethan stood behind him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Robert opened the door. "Welcome home." Ethan looked at his father. He understood what those words meant. Not ownership, not inheritance, not entitlement. An invitation. They spent the weekend together. They cooked dinner, sat by the fireplace, and talked about Margaret. For the first time in years, Ethan asked his father questions about her. What she was like when they first met, what she dreamed about, why the mountain retreat had meant so much to her. Robert answered every question, and somewhere between those conversations, something inside both men finally began to heal. Later that night, Ethan stood alone on the porch. Robert joined him. Ethan looked out at the mountains. You know, Dad? What? I used to think this place was what you were leaving me. Robert smiled. And now? Ethan looked at him. Now I think the best thing you could leave me is what you taught me. Robert nodded. What did I teach you? Ethan smiled sadly. That love doesn't mean giving people everything they want. He paused. It means respecting them enough to let them remain themselves. Robert looked toward the mountains. I think your mother would have liked that answer. Ethan smiled. I think so too. The two men stood quietly beside each other. The mountains were dark against the evening sky. The same view Robert had seen decades earlier with Margaret. The same dream. But somehow, it felt different now. Robert finally understood something he had spent years learning the hard way. A parent can give their child a home. They can give them opportunities. They can give them everything they have. But they should never have to give up their dignity to prove that they love them. And sometimes, the hardest thing a parent can do is say no to someone they love. Not because they stopped loving them, but because they finally learned to love themselves too. Robert never regretted building the mountain retreat. He never regretted loving his son. And he never regretted standing up for himself, because in the end, the greatest inheritance he could leave Ethan wasn't a house sitting on a mountain. It was a lesson. Never mistake someone's kindness for permission to take advantage of them. And never wait until you've lost someone's trust to realize how valuable their love was.